Okay, let's get going. Let me get my little controller here. Who knows, we might actually change the slide today. Well, actually, we're starting with one actually that we pretty much finished with last week, so I just want to kind of recap for a second here. So we are still talking in 2 Peter, where Peter is talking about these false prophets, these people who are coming in and they're greedy, and they are taking advantage of people because they are either they don't know what the truth is, or they are able to be misled about the truth. And so last week we looked at this idea where Peter says that in their greed they will exploit you with false words. So exploit the idea that greed isn't just about money. That's the thing we see the most often, obviously, in society and in the world in general. But greed can be about power. Greed can be about prestige. Greed can be about even just being greedy for having more people who follow you and listen to you. And in the case here that what we're talking about, this idea that they are exploiting people. And we talked about how, somebody like what we see with a lot of televangelists and what we see with a lot of religious leaders is this exploitative use of their moral power. And that idea of guilt, or a sense of, in the case of a lot of these religious leaders, it's the opposite of that. They're not even going to tell you anything negative, they're just going to tell you nice things. And then people contribute, and people buy into that because they've been fed this lie that what faith is about giving to this person, or is about sowing a seed, to use the prosperity theology term. And then we also explored the idea that even within our own fellowship, the danger there isn't so much necessarily profiteering, where people are becoming rich, although there have been examples of churches where a preacher or an elder has taken advantage of their position and has embezzled. Certainly, there have been examples of people, whether it's an elder or a deacon, who had access to the finances, who've taken some money. And the unfortunate thing when you think about religious organizations is there's a tendency to trust in those organizations that is greater than in most secular organizations. Most corporations are pretty careful about their books because their money is their existence. If they don't maintain their profits, if they don't maintain their assets, they're in trouble. Churches tend to think, and rightly so, in terms of souls, in terms of doing good, and sometimes that has led to a blind spot with regard to someone exploiting them financially. And so you can get people to invest in things sometimes, if it's a church thing, a church bond or something like that. Or there's been some insurance scandals. This isn't the Church of Christ, but I forget which, I want to say it was the Baptist Church a number of years ago that had this huge insurance and investment scandal that built, I think, hundreds of millions of dollars out of Baptists across the country, because they thought, this is through the church, it must be legitimate. And so it makes it easier. And in our fellowship, the greater concern more is the power of the sense of guilt, or the sense of morality that people have, that we're supposed to honor our leaders, and we're supposed to do what they say, and we're supposed to presume that they are doing the right thing. And because we don't always choose our leaders in some of the best ways, that has led churches to follow some very bad characters, in the sense of perhaps not stealing the money again, but using their powers in ways that are manipulative and ultimately aren't necessarily soul-focused so much as they are kind of hierarchical in their nature. Okay, so that was last week. So this week, if I can get this thing to play along here. There we go. This week, Peter says their judgment from long ago is not idle. Their destruction is not asleep. He's talking about these false prophets. And the concern a lot of times that we get is, after Jesus came and left and came back again and left again, and that was almost 2,000 years ago. I mean, we're getting real close to the 2,000-year mark for that, and yet nothing's happened since then. Lots of things have happened since then, but he hasn't come back yet. And for us today, it's easy to start thinking, he's probably not going to come back anytime real soon. I get away with some stuff. I'm probably okay. And that seems to be the mindset that some of the people in Peter's time had, which you think about, that was only, a few decades after Jesus had left. You'd think they'd have been a little more worried about it, right? But the thing is, remember that a lot of the people, or maybe we don't remember, I shouldn't say remember, I don't know if you know it or not. A lot of the people during that time period expected Jesus' return to be pretty quickly. Because remember, some of the things that he talked about in terms of end times, he said these things will happen before everybody here's dead. Now we have come to understand, based on the circumstances that we've observed, that almost certainly what he was saying was that some of the end time phenomenon, the things that are happening as a result of being in the end times, which we have been in since his resurrection, that those things did come about while people were still alive that had been walking with him. But at the time, they interpreted that as being a pretty immediate thing. And some of Paul's early writings, he seems to be saying, hey, get ready, he's coming back any minute now. And the Thessalonians said, all right, let's go get on the roof and wait for him to come back. And so Paul has to write another letter to them saying, you idiots, get off the roof and do something productive, Never mentions, hey, I might have sort of confused you about how quick this is going to happen, but nevertheless, that mindset of it's not happening, so let's just make some money off of this, That's kind of where these people are coming from. And Peter says, don't fool yourself. There's still going to be consequences. There's still going to be a judgment. There's still going to be a destruction for doing contrary to God's will. So in Jeremiah is dealing with a similar problem where you have these prophets who are not afraid because they keep prophesying falsehoods and no one punishes them because, of course, the people of Judah like hearing from them. And they've been getting away with it for so long, but they've seen Israel be taken into captivity already by the Assyrians, and yet there's still no humility there. These prophets are still operating. And so Jeremiah, speaking for God, says, the Lord said to me, the prophets are prophesying falsehood in my name. I have neither sent them nor commanded them nor spoken to them. They are prophesying to you a false vision, divination, futility, and the deception of their own minds. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the prophets who are prophesying in my name, although it is not I who sent them, yet they keep saying, there will be no sword or famine in this land. By sword and famine those prophets shall meet therein. So he says there is consequences coming. And Jeremiah would routinely be in conflict with false prophets. Now, in Israel, they kind of sort of abandoned the pretense of speaking on behalf of the Lord. Most of the prophets did. They were prophets of Baal and Asher and whatever else, but under Ahab and others, that was fine. They didn't mind hearing from other prophets. They didn't even try to claim to be prophets of the Lord. But in Judah, there was a lot more common tendency to claim that you were a prophet of the Lord when you wanted to prophesy falsely, because there was, at least occasionally, an effort to reform and go back. You had a lot of bad kings in there, but you had people like Jehoshaphat and Josiah and some of those who would reform and who would bring God back in front. And so if you were a false prophet, when those guys came into power, that was a bad place to be. So they were, at least in name, prophesying in the name of the Lord. But they weren't really doing it. And at the end of this, it's going to end with sword and famine, because eventually Nebuchadnezzar is going to bring the Babylonian army, and they're going to take over, and that's going to be the end of it. And I still remember there was a conversation between Jeremiah and a false prophet. I can't remember what the false prophet's name was, but he was a false prophet. He was a close associate of the king, and I believe that this was near the very end. So this is there's three kings that come very quickly at the very end of Israel: Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah. Right before Jehoiakim, there's a king that lasts a little bit longer, and Jeremiah is prophesying during his time. And he's saying, maybe it was actually during one of those later ones, but he's saying basically the Babylonians are coming. You've been paying them tribute, you've been trying to keep them out, but they're coming. And you know it's too late now. You can't shape up. It's too late. And the king's personal prophet says to him, and he's being sarcastic. He says, "So which way did the Spirit from the Lord go after he left you?" Because he's basically saying, what you're making this up. And which way did the Spirit of the Lord go when he came from me and then left you? So he's trying to make it sound like, I'm saying what the Lord is saying and everything's going to be fine, and you're saying something different. So you didn't really, you're making this up. And Jeremiah's response is, you'll find out the day you go hide in an inner room. And basically what ends up happening is that prophet, when the armies come, he goes and tries to hide in an inner room, and he gets dragged out and killed instead. So it's a really interesting exchange between the two of them. But that's this idea. These prophets think we've got the king on our side, we've got the government on our side, we can say whatever we want to. And it's not going to matter. Because the sword isn't a threat when the government is behind you. And in a way, the one, if you want to say, downside to the freedom of religion that we enjoy in this country, the hands-off approach that the government has taken towards religion in a general sense, is that it has allowed the proliferation of those who not only preach falsehoods, but who do it in very transparently harmful ways. And the government is very unwilling to really go after those, even though in some cases there might be the tools within our legal system to go after them. There was a brief period of time where the Senate was investigating some of the more extreme prosperity theology televangelists, and they finally just backed off because it was clear that their own electorate, the people who voted for them, were not okay with it, and so they just had to leave it alone. And so when you don't seem to have any consequences, it seems easy to be able to say whatever you want to. But God reminds people over and over again in the scriptures that there is a consequence. And it may not be in this lifetime, but there will be a consequence. You can't ignore that. So Peter says that their judgment isn't idle, their destruction isn't asleep. Anybody have any thoughts you want to add to that before we go to the next slide here? Jerry?
I can't remember where it is, probably Proverbs or Psalms, but it actually talks about that God's not paying any attention. We can do what we want to.
Yeah.
My phrasing.
Or the mindset that says that. Yeah. So let's continue, because we're going to continue to look at this a little bit longer. So again, looking back into the Old Testament in Jeremiah, Jeremiah says, "Among the prophets of Jerusalem, I have seen a horrible thing. The committing of adultery and walking in falsehood. They strengthen the hands of evildoers, so no one has turned back from his wickedness. All of them have become to me like Sodom, and her inhabitants like Gomorrah. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the prophets, Behold, I am going to feed them wormwood, and make them drink poisonous water, for from the prophets of Jerusalem pollution has gone forth into all the land." So he's saying, not only are they misbehaving, not only are they teaching falsehoods, but they are also engaging in blatantly ungodly behavior, adultery and walking in falsehood. And not only that, but they are also strengthening the hands of evildoers. They're saying their false teachings are making it more likely that people will do bad things. We've seen a sort of a similar example of this when Paul is talking in Romans about the degeneration of the human condition, where he talks about, there's sin, or actually first there's a refusal to acknowledge God, and chasing after idols, and so God hands them over to sexual desires, and they chase after those, and finally he hands them over to a greater spirit of depravity, until at the end of this, one of the things he says about them is, they not only tolerate other things to be done, but they approve of it and even kind of push it forward as this is what you should do. That's the kind of mindset that we get into, and these false prophets are doing that. They are not only prophesying falsely for their own gain, but they're prophesying falsely in order to make other bad people feel emboldened to do other bad things. And of course, then he says they become like Sodom and Gomorrah. That's when you're pretty bad, when you hit the point when you've become like Sodom and Gomorrah. When you're that level of violence and evil and perversion and all of that stuff, and that's going on in Israel. And we see some examples in the Old Testament in both the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, and even prior to that among the judges, where some of the stuff that was going on was comparable to what was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. It was some time ago that we looked at the story in Judges of the Levite whose concubine was killed, and it was just this horrible situation. So God says, I'm going to feed them wormwood. What's wormwood in this context?
I'm never sure exactly if it is really a wood or not, but it's
like sawdust.
Yeah, or
it's in this case it's a poison, is what he's going to feed them.
Yeah.
Because he says, I'm going to feed them wormwood and make them drink poisonous water. The other references you see in the scriptures, I'm trying to remember, but I believe in Revelation there's a reference to wormwood being thrown into the waters and it pollutes everything. But the idea of wormwood is that it's something polluting.
Wormwood is a bushy type plant native to North Africa that is very bitter in taste and used to distill and flavor the liquor absinthe.
Okay.
It is in concentrated doses. If you were to like rip off a plant like a leaf of wormwood, it would probably kill you.
And because absinthe can kill you if it's not purified properly and if you drink too much of it, so that would make sense. Okay, so that helps because North Africa, that would be so that they would be familiar with it. That kind of explains why most of us are not, because we don't exactly grow it around here. So the idea though is God is being he's engaging in a what's the word I'm looking for here? It's you're doing this, so I'm going to do something similar, thematically similar. You are polluting my land. I'm going to pollute you with poison, and you're going to die as a result of that. So this is not a literal, I'm going to poison you, make you die, but the idea is that you are going to drink the fruit of your lies by leading people astray. And in Jeremiah's case, the problem with what these people were doing was Jeremiah was getting news from God saying, if they don't turn, it's almost over. It's getting closer. It's like the doomsday clock. It's just getting a little closer to midnight. And these false prophets are going, no, everything's fine. Keep right on doing stuff. And so people are listening to the false prophets instead of Jeremiah because that is a much more pleasant thing to hear. Everything's fine. Don't worry, So they listened to them instead of Jeremiah. And so what might have happened, they might have reformed, they might have done better. Nobody does because nobody's listening to the guy who's actually telling the truth. Jerry.
There's not very many names mentioned in the Old Testament, but there does appear to be valid prophets.
Oh yeah.
That were beyond those that we have in writing, that did prophesy from the Lord.
Yes.
So there was this conflict between God's prophets and evil prophets.
Yes.
But they're not. You can see even in this verse that he's referring to good prophets as well as bad prophets.
And and the bad prophets seem to usually outnumber the good prophets, and the good prophets always seem to be in trouble with the law because the law doesn't like them either. I'm trying to think if it was. I want to say it was Elijah talking to. I'm not sure it was Obadiah the prophet, but it was a guy named Obadiah who had been one of the king. He was one of the servants of Ahab who had hidden a group of prophets away to keep them from getting executed. So there were definitely other good prophets besides just the ones who wrote these books that we know about. And many of the prophets who wrote the books, or the prophecies, which we call the books now, they were working at the same time as one another. So there'd be one who'd be prophesying, another one prophesying somewhere else, especially when it came to Israel and Judah, they would be in different places. So there's overlap as well. But there are definitely other good prophets who are saying this is what God wants. They probably just didn't get enough of a revelation to be worth writing a whole narrative down or something like that. But there are some good ones, and there are a lot more bad ones. Because, of course, you don't actually have to be getting the word of the Lord to be a bad prophet, as long as you get people to listen to you. It's one of the kind of astonishing things when you think about it, how, stepping aside from the religious aspect of this, how often leaders can be led astray by people who say nice things and make them feel good about themselves or about the decisions they're making, and then, kind of gradually pull them away from making good decisions. Look at in Russian history, the Tsar, who was very much near the end of the Tsarist existence, had the priest or monk Rasputin who came in, and because Rasputin was kind of skilled at fooling people, and also because he seemed to be really hard to kill, the Tsar began to listen to him and put what he wanted and what he was saying ahead of wise governance, and that was one of the things that led to a great deal of animosity between him and the people of Russia. Not that things weren't already bad. So it's not hard to get leaders sometimes to follow you if they're willing to, if they're hearing what they want to hear. So, okay, so the prophets are they're behaving falsely, and there are going to be false teachers in the church who are going to be pursuing not what God wants and not what the scriptures say, but what they want, what they're doing. And here again, this group that he's talking about, one aspect of the Gnostic belief was this idea of licentiousness. Do whatever you want to do. And that ties right in with some of the stuff that Jeremiah is saying about these prophets. And the last one on this, if we look over Revelation, In Revelation it says, and this is talking about the false prophets who testify on behalf of the Antichrist. Well, I shouldn't say that. That's not how it's identified. The false prophets in this context are the Antichrist that a lot of people assume. These are this beast and this false prophet are Satan and someone who is his chief representative on earth. And Revelation says the beast was seized, and with him the false prophet who performed the signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire which burns with brimstone. And the rest were killed with the sword which came from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh. This is the very end of Revelation where the judgment is taking place. Well, the return of Christ is taking place, and there's an immediate judgment on those who are fighting against him and who are following after Satan. And then there is a judgment that is made, and then there's the righteous are taken away, and the evil are thrown into this lake of fire. So Revelation, although the language is highly symbolic, thank you, that was the word I'm looking for, symbolic and apocalyptic, the idea is still that there will be a judgment. There is going to be a consequence. Jesus talks about the sheep and the goats. Others talk about a different way. Jesus, in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, talks about two outcomes, paradise and torment. There's no getting away from the fact that if you accept the theology of Christianity, if you accept Christ as a teacher, as the Son of God he claims to be, you can't ignore the fact that he has said there will be a judgment. There will be consequences, and you cannot avoid those simply because somebody else told you something different. There's an expectation. One of the reasons there's urgency in spreading the gospel is because this is something that's a consequence that all of humanity is facing because of their sin. And so those who teach falsely are particularly dangerous because they make it easier for people to believe something other than what God wants them to believe. And of course, in our modern society, not only do we have lots of false prophets in terms of religion, but we have even more false prophets in the sense of people leading you astray to chase after what the world wants you to chase after, money or accumulation of possessions, or accumulation of power, or your desires, whatever they might be, or just numbing your brain by staring at a screen and not thinking about anything else. There are all sorts of things that distract us and take us away from that. So Peter wants us to remember, just because it hasn't happened right away doesn't mean it isn't going to happen. Okay? All right, so let's move on to the next part of 2 Peter. This is the one that in Jude is the fun one, and in 2 Peter it's also, he expands it a little bit further just to really mess with you. So he says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, and if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ash, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly lives thereafter. And if he rescued, this is a long sentence, by the way. If he rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men, for by what he saw and heard that righteous man, while living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day by their lawless deeds, then," we're wrapping up the sentence now, "then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation, and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge the flesh in its corrupt desires and despise authority." So right there at the end there, the fun thing is, especially, by the way, you Gnostics. He could have just said it that way almost, because he's directing it straight at them when he says this, okay? Now, in some ways, this is a little bit of an easier passage, and I'm not sure, because I think we're going to get into some of the more confusing stuff a little bit later in Peter. This is a little bit easier passage than the one that we looked at in Jude, where he starts talking about angels and some of that kind of stuff, because here we have other examples in the scripture that talk about angels falling. And in particular, we see it in Revelation, where it says, in Revelation chapter 12, there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old who was called the devil and Satan, and deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Now, a lot of theology for a lot of different denominations has come out of what we see in 2 Peter, what we see here. One of the discussions of the king of Tyre over in, is it Hosea? That's not right. I forget who it is that talks about this. And they, they pull all these things together, and they conclude that the prophecy about the king of Tyre is referring to not just the king of Tyre, but it's also when it talks about the morning star being cast down, that it's an analogy, or that it's talking about the king of Tyre, and he is a type relative to Satan, who was the morning star and was cast down, because the morning star translates as Lucifer in Greek. So the idea is that he was cast down, and that he therefore is associated with this dragon, Satan, who was thrown down as well. It's a little dangerous to conclude that from the passages that actually exist in the scriptures. That is very possibly the correct interpretation, but it may or may not be correct, just because it's an interpretation. So it's not entirely clear from the scriptures that it was God's angels that were fighting here, because whose angels does it say fought against Michael and his angels? Whose angels fought against them? The dragon's angels. It doesn't say some of God's angels fought on Michael's side, and some of God's angels fought on the dragon's side, and the angels that were working with Michael on God's side cast out the angels that were working for Satan and cast them out. So, because the word angel doesn't just mean divine being of heavenly light. What does the word angel literally mean? Messenger, or representative. In fact, actually, a modern day word that might even be better, we don't use it, it's come into existence, well, it's been around for a while, but the way we use it has kind of changed, would be almost like avatar. Okay? An avatar is one who represents you with your authority, basically, or in the game is actually the character you're playing or something like that. But there are times in the Old Testament where we see the angel of the Lord being referred to in one sentence as the angel of the Lord, and in the next sentence as the Lord. And so the closeness between the angel and the master is very, very similar. But just saying angels are fighting, if they are angels of Michael and angels of the dragon, then strictly speaking, they would be messengers or representatives of those two groups, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they are God's angels that are fighting, although one would presume that the ones that are fighting with Michael, on Michael's behalf, are allied with God and therefore his as well. But we make a lot of assumptions about some of these passages, and I think we have to be a little bit careful about that, because it's not entirely clear from the scriptures where these angels come from that are serving Satan. But it certainly does appear from what Peter said that there are angels who have fallen. And they have fallen and they've been cast into hell, into pits of darkness, reserved for judgment. You notice there, the judgment hasn't finished yet, but they've been cast out of God's presence, and they are now reserved for judgment. So, again, it's complicated to say exactly what the relationship is here, but certainly the most reasonable interpretation historically has been that these are the same angels, that these are angels who got cast out because they rebelled against God, and they lost the rebellion, and they got cast down, and now they're working with Satan to try to deceive the world, basically. But the key point here is when we talk about angels, that these are beings whose sole purpose was to serve God and to be messengers and representatives on his behalf, and nevertheless, when they sinned, they got punished. They got thrown down and cast out of heaven, out of God's presence. And so if God will do that to them, then surely he's not going to ignore the sin and the evil of humanity, who were created with moral responsibilities, with the ability to choose between right or wrong. He is going to expect us to do what he's telling us, and especially when you have somebody like these prophets who are, these teachers who are leading people astray, there's going to be consequences for that. And you're not going to get away with it just because you think you're special or something. Okay, so And then it talks about Sodom and Gomorrah as examples of those who would live ungodly lives there. Now, I don't have to tell you about Sodom and Gomorrah. I think you all are familiar with the story. What I think is really interesting about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is actually the conversation that God has with himself before he goes down, or before his angels go down and end up destroying Sodom, or calling down fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah. Because when the Lord first appears to Abram, along with these two men, there's these three men that come and they visit Abraham while he's sitting under under a tree, basically outside of his tent. And I don't think initially that Abraham realizes that he's in the presence of God or anything else like that. He just thinks they're just three travelers. It's just like any good Middle Easterner, he immediately offers them hospitality. Come and sit down, we'll make you a meal, we'll get you something to drink, you can sit in the shade and relax a little bit, that sort of thing. So then as they're eating and they begin talking, they have, I guess, what is a relatively normal conversation, and at some point in this conversation, Abraham begins to realize that he's not just talking to three normal guys. But the scriptures say that two of them got up and headed on down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and the Lord remained there with Abraham. Depending on the translation, the more common translation is that Abraham remained standing before the Lord. There's actually one interpretation, one of the ancient ones, that says that the Lord remained standing before Abraham. But either way, the idea is God's waiting. And God's talking to himself. And God says, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. For I have chosen him, so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring about upon Abraham what he has spoken to him. So, God says, I think I need to tell Abraham what's about to happen and why it's about to happen. Why? Why does he feel an obligation?
He's made a promise to Abraham, and that, that he will have a family, and his again, very common, what you said already, there will be judgment for sin.
Okay.
That Sodom and Gomorrah are not following God, and God is going to use them as an example for centuries afterwards.
Okay. So what is he telling Abraham? What is the goal of him telling Abraham what he's going to do? You're absolutely right about what you've kind of set the foundation for us. So let's build a little bit on that. Why is he telling Abraham what he's going to do and why he's going to do it? With that as the basis.
Prepare him and let him prepare his family.
Okay. So perhaps it's about preparation. What else?
I am God.
Okay, fine. That's a little bit generic, but sure. Okay. Ian.
I think it shows God's trust in Abraham.
Okay, so one of the things that I think is definitely happening here is that God is saying to Abraham, you're a partner. You know, you're a friend, you're a partner. I need you to understand what's going to happen here, because you are going to be the one who teaches your kids, and they teach their kids, and down the road I'm going to give a law to a guy that's one of your descendants, and they need to have some kind of a basis in understanding what real righteousness looks like. Sarah, what were you going to say?
Are we tying Sodom and Gomorrah to the promise, or are we talking about them exclusively?
Kind of however you want to run with it.
Well, wouldn't this relate then to the battle in heaven, where if you do bad things will happen to you? So I'm going to go down and destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, but at the same time I'm going to make you a great nation. So even though you have family down there and I need to confide in you that this is going to happen, and I understand your hurt, that if you allow what Lot has allowed to happen, you are going to face destruction.
Okay, he's making, and I think this is the critical thing. I think, and maybe this is what you were going to get, Jerry, but I want to make it a little more explicit. He's making a clear connection between what's happening to Sodom and Gomorrah, what's going to happen to them, and what they have been doing that has led to that. Because if God didn't come and talk to Abraham about it, if he didn't explain the purpose of it, and ultimately have the discussion with Abraham about trying to find even 10 righteous men, you know, down from, I'm just going to destroy it, to 100, to gradually talking him down to 10, and one of the finest examples of Jewish lawyering in all of history, Abraham would have never known for sure what was the reason? Now, he knew Sodom was evil. Remember, way back when Lot first started living in that area, the other kings came and kidnapped or attacked Sodom and Gomorrah and kidnapped the residents and took them off. Abraham rescued them. When the king of Sodom offered to give him some stuff, he's like, I'm not taking anything from you, dude. Because he knew how messed up they were. So Abraham would have known they were evil, and then he would have known they got destroyed. But the problem with that is that you never know for sure that that's why they got destroyed. And that's the mistake we make today sometimes, is we say, okay, somebody did something bad, and something totally unrelated bad happened to them, and it's because they did something bad. But that's not always true. The people who were hit by a gigantic tsunami in Indonesia 10 years or 15 years ago or something like that, hundreds of thousands were killed. I don't think that was some sort of a punishment directed at those people specifically for the things that they were doing. That they were worse than all the other people of Indonesia and the surrounding regions and stuff. It was those guys, they were the really bad ones. God was judging them. I don't think the Japanese that lived on the coast where the reactor was, that got hit by an earthquake, tsunami, and then nuclear meltdown, were especially bad Japanese people. They might not have been good people, but they probably weren't any worse than anybody else was. So a lot of times when we see natural disasters, the tendency, or something bad happened to someone, the tendency is to say, what did they do wrong? And that was a tendency that Jesus had to fight against with the blind man that he encountered. And his apostles are saying, who sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus says, nobody did. God did it to him so I could prove something to you. Well, you want to talk about messing with your theology right there. You didn't do anything wrong. God did this. What? How, you mean God does these kind of these? So sometimes bad things happen, and maybe there's a purpose to it, but it isn't always because somebody did something bad. But God's judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah is unusual because the things that happen to Sodom and Gomorrah are not explicable in any other rational way. And so God is saying to Abraham, I need you to know that this is not an accident, this isn't some freak of nature, this is me very specifically causing judgment. And not only that, by setting the situation up to give Abraham that opportunity to negotiate with him, he also makes it clear to Abraham, what can Abraham be sure of? Because he trusts God. He believes in God. What can he be sure of when the fire and brimstone begin to fall on Sodom and Gomorrah? Because of his negotiation with God. What can he be sure of?
There was less than 10 good men.
There were fewer than 10 good men in that city. That's pretty cool. And I got to think that a lot of why God did it the way he did was exactly to set that up so that Abraham would recognize that. That this is judgment, and it's judgment because there was nobody righteous in this city. The one righteous guy I got out, in fact.
But wouldn't you think Abraham would also be thinking, Lot and I just separated our herds, and he chose this valley and I chose this valley, and it took only this little bit of time for that much destruction to happen and that much influence to happen to Lot.
Yeah, so I mean, the idea is to impress on Abraham that God is just, that there's a reason for what he's doing, and that there is, in fact, a judgment for evil. So that Abraham will impress that on his children and the children after him, so that when Moses comes along, he doesn't have to lay the foundation from zero of what this means. And so even though God has to explain to the Israelites the laws and these kinds of things, he doesn't have to begin by explaining, hey, you know what, there's good stuff, there's bad stuff, and bad stuff leads to bad consequences. The Israelites already understand that basic principle, even if they've kind of got a warped sense of what the bad stuff really is.
I was just going to say, and two, his judgment was almost instantaneously.
Yeah.
Because, hey, you do this, this is what's going to happen to you. You didn't have this big revolt like, wait a second, you can't do that to us. No, they knew it. They knew, hey, if we did something, this was going to be our punishment because of this foundation. Now,
on the one hand, God allows Sodom and Gomorrah to go along for quite a long time, it seems, because they were evil before Lot and Abraham ever got there. But on the so on the one hand, you say, okay, well, we've been allowed to go on for a while. There wasn't an immediate judgment. But on the other hand, when God says judgment is here, judgment is there. And there's no negotiation, and there's no escaping it, and there's no hiding from it. The judgment comes, and it is absolute, and it is virtually instantaneous. Yeah, there's no getting away from it. And not only is the judgment, does it wipe out the people of Sodom and Gomorrah? Given what was dropped on Sodom and Gomorrah, it makes the area of Sodom and Gomorrah completely unsuitable for human habitation afterward. Because you can't grow anything in the soil. In fact, there are a lot of, a number of biblical scholars that believe, based on a number of things, including some archaeological evidence, that Sodom and Gomorrah may actually be underneath the southern edge of what is now the Dead Sea. That the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah may have basically opened up a way for the sea to kind of flood in and flow over that. But regardless, nobody's ever going to build anything there again because of what was put into the soil from dropping the sulfur or the fire and brimstone on them. So this is a very complete judgment. And it's a very instantaneous one, and it's one from which there's no appeal or escape or any of that kind of stuff. And I think that's where modern Americans get in trouble. Because we think, I mean, all you have to do is pay attention to our court system to realize it takes a long time for any sort of a meaningful judgment to actually take place. You know, someone's found guilty of murdering people, they're sentenced to death, and it's like 25 years later, maybe, that they finally get executed for that. It takes forever to do anything. And there's appeals, and it seems like for so many of our court cases, the longer they meander through the courts, the more bits of actual consequence kind of get shed off of them. You know, and if you can prolong it long enough, maybe you're never going to have to pay the money that you owe somebody. Maybe you're never really going to face the consequences. Think about the number of famous criminals who did some really bad stuff who managed to prolong their cases to the point where they died before the final judgment was even in. You know, so this is, we think of our justice system as a revolving door. We think of it as this super long process. But in God's case, judgment isn't so much saying, yeah, you're definitely bad. Judgment is saying, you're bad, now comes the consequence. And so God isn't interested in litigating whether you're evil. He has already defined what evil is, and he has a standard, and so there's no problem with deciding who's evil. The only question is, what is the judgment and when is it going to happen? And that's the thing that we have to keep in mind, that just because it's been a long time doesn't mean that judgment isn't coming. Okay, people are starting to come in, some of them are related to me, so it's time for me to stop talking, and we'll pick up with the worship in a